When you're starting out a new project, to kind of get your head wrapped around things, I always recommend sitting down and writing at least one use case scenario. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to think about who's the user that's going to be using my application, how are they going to be using my application, and are there any nuances as you kind of write out almost this narrative of this user that come to mind of how the person does their business or how the program would be used. That'll help you build a much more efficient application for the user. Not necessarily efficient in terms of performance, but efficient for that user. How many of those tasks that user has to complete with the application, how many of them can you do as the programmer versus that person having to do them as clicks in your program? Quite often, if you can minimize the amount of user interaction in your application, it also ultimately allows you to build an easier application for yourself in some respects. You don't have to deal with as much UI management of users doing different actions and things like that. And if they click this, then the screen appears and so forth. So instead, it's you click a button, you write a whole bunch of code that does some stuff, but you don't have to deal with the user. You just kind of give them maybe screen updates, or you do a series of tasks and then notify them when the next step is ready. So for you as the programmer, I find that that can be much more efficient in trying to limit the amount of steps the user has to perform versus you doing them internally as the developer. So when you're writing a use case document or a use case scenario and you're working on building out your model classes, what you may find is that there's a lot of different tools out there, there's a lot of different options, and they're all perfectly good options. There's even a standard for doing this type of documentation. It's called UML. And I'm not here to say anything bad about any of those things. I'm just kind of sharing what I prefer to use. UML is a standard. It's a interoperable document format, and that's what it's designed to be. You can actually generate UML from within Visual Studio with your projects. You can generate UML in a lot of different scenarios. But the way that I like to kind of just say, I'm going to start a new project. I have a task that I need to accomplish. This is for my own internal documentation, my own thinking. I like to just start with a Word doc. Nothing fancy, nothing complex, just a blank piece of paper essentially, and then I like to start to write things out. So I'm going to take this Word document and I like to just say use case scenario at the top. If there's a specific user that I'm writing the scenario for, then I'll put that information in as well. So I'm writing a point of sale application, so I'm going to make my use case scenario be for the clerk. And that's just kind of my little header to say this is what I'm writing. Alright, so we go through and we just simply write a narrative. We would say something to the effect of the user logs in to the system. Alright, so there's kind of my use case scenario document for the clerk. And all that that's going to do is just kind of lets me flush out flow and process for the application. So now the next piece to this is to actually look at this document and start to identify nouns or items that I may need to create as classes in my program. So as we go through here, we have I like to just kind of start at the beginning and work my way through. So I have a user, and that user is going to do a certain task, such as log in. So I'm going to say these are just my models, and I'm just going to create a list of them for now. So we'll say user, and this is kind of like the first glance. We may end up consolidating or even eliminating some of them, but just as we walk through, we'll look at that information. So we have a user, we have that they'll be presented with a new transaction, so we can call it transaction. There will be items. I'm not exactly sure what an item means, but we'll be looking them up by typing in the product keywords, UPC codes. So maybe a UPC code is one of our models. Let's see, what else do we have here? Quantity. I know that's not a noun necessarily, but that is something that we're going to want to keep track of because that's important. We have an idea of an order here. And then once the items are in the cart, we're going to have things such as subtotal, tax, and final total that we'll need to track. We'll be receiving a payment, and we have change to give, and there's a customer. So we may want to track all of those different pieces. So these are just a rough glance looking at this use case document. Those are the models that I've come up with. Now, just again, this is kind of the first glance at this, but let's start to kind of analyze what we're looking at here and say, are the pieces related to one another? Do we need to consolidate things together, and so forth? So the user is the person who logs in. So that's our user for our application. The transaction is probably the same as the order. So I'm going to go ahead and use the word order. And I'm going to get rid of transaction. So then we have an item, which item is kind of a generic term. So I'm going to call this the product. Now our product has a UPC code. So that is actually going to end up becoming a property of our product class. The quantity has to do with the item, the number of products in the order. So we'll just leave that where it is for now. The subtotal will be a property of the order. So once we add up all the items in the order, the tax, the final total, the payment, and the change actually will all become properties as well. So we'll put those all underneath the order. So now that we've done that, we have things such as quantity and customer. So the customer itself will end up being one of those objects. We might capture customer information for our own purposes of tracking who they are, what their purchases are, what they like to buy. And you actually see this in a lot of places, such as like a Kroger or a Walgreens, where they have loyalty cards. Those are basically ways for them to track their customers' purchasing habits, and then they are able to send you coupons. So that's how those systems kind of work in a very broad sense. So we have things like quantity. Now, quantity is kind of an interesting in-between. So you have to think about this. So if you have an order, which is the overall purchase, it's everything that's in your cart. You have a product, but then in between there, your quantity is the number of products bought, or number of products is kind of like a line item of that order. So what we may end up needing to do, and honestly this is from experience, we're going to need to create an order item object, and that order item will have a quantity and it will have a product. So what we'll ultimately end up doing is we'll create an order, we'll add products to the order, but each time we add a product it will become an order item. So that order item will act as kind of a go-between and say, well, this is attached to an order, but this is this product this many times. So that we can say we're buying 4 tires. So the product is a tire, but we're buying 4 of them. So that line item or that order item says that we're buying 4 tires. So that will be that construct. So there's kind of a bit of a hierarchy there, if you can see that right now. Products, so let's kind of talk about what are other properties that we need. So a product, easy one, will be a name. There'll probably be some sort of description. There's going to be a price, a unit price. Maybe we'll call that a unit price. What else could we put in here? So we'll just kind of, we'll make this organic. We'll go on our way. So customer is going to have first name, a last name, email address, a mailing address. And that mailing address will have street number, street name, city, state, and zip code. There may be a phone number, and then we could have multiple kinds of phone numbers. We could have a home and a mobile. So that'll be a good starting point. Our user will be similar, so they'll have first name, last name, and email address. They'll probably also have a username and a password. So we'll have a good bit of information there. We could have maybe their job title, the location where they work, and that's a good start there. So let's kind of revisit the order. So the order will have a subtotal. It'll have the tax for the order, the final total. When we make a payment, we'll track what that payment was, and we have change. So the other thing we'll probably have here is probably a list of order items. So every time we create an order item and we add it to the order, that needs to go into something of a collection. And then that's how we'll generate our subtotal, our tax, and our final total. The order item itself will have a product, and just because that's how I think of it as a product and a quantity. It may then calculate a line item total, and that would be helpful if that was a calculated property, because then as the quantity changed, the line item total changes, and then when we go through to actually calculate the subtotal, we simply add up the line item total. And we'll get into the mechanics of how that would work later. Product, like we said before, it'll have a name, description, a UPC code, and a unit price, and then the customer. So this is all a good start. So this was all kind of derived and put together simply by thinking through our application and what it'll do, how it'll function, and starting to carve out for ourselves some logic around the way that the contents of our application will flow and be handled. The next step will be to take this document and open it side by side within Visual Studio, and then start to actually create classes within our application so that we can then begin to build our application utilizing these models.